Hello, I'm Christina Burke. I'm a curator of Native American art, currently based in Tulsa, Oklahoma, within the boundaries of the Muskogee Creek Nation. I'm pleased to be with you today to present Sharing a Legacy, the pottery of Maria and Santana Martinez, which is presented in conjunction with the temporary exhibition, Art, Music, and Feminism in the 1950s at Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. This exhibition features painting, sculpture, and pottery, including this collaborative piece by Maria Martinez and her daughter-in-law Santana, which is a fine example of the black-on-black pottery that was made famous by Maria and her husband Julian and other members of their family in the 20th century. I'm really grateful to Miriam Thomas for inviting me to give this talk today and to share some of the inspiration and creativity of these two incredible Indigenous artists, again, who are known for pottery and whose work is in the collection of the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts in other areas as well. So these two black-on-black pieces, I think one of them is also on exhibit, but just to give you some other examples of work by Maria Martinez and members of her family, this black-on-black ware that they made famous and that's now found in collections around the world. This presentation will include a short introduction telling you a little bit about myself and why I'm here even talking about Native American art. We'll look at the long tradition of Pueblo pottery, which goes back from time immemorial and continues to this day. Look at the multi-step process and the collaboration among genders, among men and women, and throughout generations of Pueblo families. We'll focus on the collaborations between Maria and Santana, look at the art traditions in each of their families and those connections across time and across generations. We'll also take a look at how Pueblo pottery fits into the larger art world and how this legacy of Pueblo pottery continues to this day. So just a little bit about myself. I've been working since the early 1990s in museums, working with Native art and Indigenous artists at such places as the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, as well as the Heritage Center at Red Cloud Indian School on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And most recently, I spent more than 16 years as curator of Native art at Philbrook Museum of Art here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. While at Philbrook, I had the great good fortune to work with an incredibly large and diverse collection of Indigenous arts that includes pottery, basketry, jewelry, painting, cultural arts, you name it, Philbrook has it. And I was able to work on a number of projects, including collections research with Indigenous artists, public programs, publications, as well as exhibitions of various kinds of artwork from painting, pottery, jewelry, etc. I also had the good fortune to work on this traveling exhibition, Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists, that was organized by the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and curated by my colleagues Jill Alberg-Yo at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and Terry Greaves, a Kiowa artist and independent curator. This exhibition was a complex and incredibly inspiring project that included an advisory board of 21 women, most of whom were Indigenous artists, curators, scholars, writers, knowledge keepers from communities across the country, and a few of us non-Indigenous curators and scholars, to create a traveling exhibition that covered hundreds of years of Indigenous creativity by Native women that traveled from Minneapolis to the Frist in Nashville, Tennessee, the Renwick in Washington, D.C., and wound up at Philbrook Museum of Art in 2020. The show included ceramics, basketry, photography, painting, textiles, you name it, this show had it. And we'll come back to a little bit about this show later, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of the sense of the collections I've worked with, the kinds of projects I've worked on, and why I'm here as a non-Native curator of Native art, talking about Indigenous ceramics from the Pueblos of the Southwest. Now, I include this map to give us a sense of place, of location. It does include colonial political boundaries. And so we see the boundaries between Canada, the US, and Mexico. But this map is of Indigenous language families, an important perspective in thinking about Native people of this place. And we're going to be talking specifically about Tewa-speaking people in the Pueblos of the Southwest in northern New Mexico. So if we look at a map of northern New Mexico, here is one way to connect these Pueblo communities based on language families. So we're going to be talking about San Ildefonso Pueblo, which is one of the Tewa-speaking Pueblos, along with Oke-Owingeh, Santa Clara, Nambe, Tusuki, and Powaki. And just for to locate ourselves here, about here is where Santa Fe is located. Now, when we look at the history of Pueblo ceramic traditions, even though we're talking about a rather small geographic area, there's incredible complexity and diversity in these artistic traditions among Pueblo communities from time immemorial. So even in this small selection of works, we see a variety of colors of clay, of shapes, of sizes, types of decoration, from carving and etching to painting. We see geometric designs, we see polished surfaces, we see matte finish surfaces, we see a real diversity in the artwork of Pueblo pottery. And when we focus on works by Maria Martinez from San Ildefonso Pueblo, again, we see incredible diversity from polychrome work, so multicolored pieces, to highly polished works, and especially that piece on the upper right corner. That particular style of finish is known as gunmetal gray. So here we have a work of art that the material is just clay and slip, so a watery form of clay painted over it, and it's polished with river rocks that have been tumbled and smoothed by being tumbled about in a river, and those tools are used to polish and burnish the surface, giving this really shiny surface. And then the firing is at a specific temperature, the details of which I do not know, but the knowledge of which is important to know when to bring it up to that temperature and then down from that temperature to create not just a shiny finish, but give it this characteristic gunmetal gray that makes clay look like it's metallic, the knowledge of which is known by only a few, and one of the things at which Maria really excelled. But just to give you a sampling of the kind of works that she created with family members throughout her career. Now, the process of creating these works and the knowledge of how to do it goes back millennia and requires time, a lot of labor, and a lot of hands. So thinking about the importance of collaboration across genders, so men and women, and throughout generations, so families who work together to create these works of art, from gathering and processing the clay to coiling and shaping it, polishing and painting it, and then firing it, knowing just what temperature to bring it up to, and then slowly bring it down in temperature so that the works don't crack. So we have a few images of this process of Maria and family members creating this process from, again, gathering the clay, knowing where in the landscape, where in the traditional territories to get the best clay, different colors and types of clay that have different properties, and then sifting it and taking out all the impurities, making it a consistent texture so that when water is added, you get the right structure to the clay. And here we see Maria's hands sifting through the powdered clay, adding water, and then kneading it, wedging it, again, to get the correct consistency and the correct moisture content to create works like you see behind her. And then Pueblo pottery traditionally, and to this day, traditional pottery methods include the coiling method. So Pueblo potters don't use a wheel to throw their works. Instead, they create these circular vessels, these spherical vessels, I should say, by hand. And by rolling out coils of clay, adding them to a base, which we see in both of these photographs, a base called a puki, that's to sort of start out your form, whether it's a shallow plate or a bowl, a larger necked vessel, or an oya. You start with this form to give it some substance and some support while you're adding the coils, smoothing out the clay, and creating the form of the vessel itself. Once you have kind of that basic shape, as we see Maria doing in both these photographs, she's smoothing it, the inside and the outside of the vessel. She has a number of tools by her side, wooden tools, for instance, to shape and smooth that vessel as each coil is added on. And we see these two vessels at different stages of being created. And we see a number of vessels around her as well. So potters, you often work on multiple pieces at one time. You also see a bowl of water next to her. If the pieces become too dry, you add a little bit of water to keep going and keep adding coils to build it up to the desired form of your vessel. Once you have the desired form, to create a polished surface, whether that's the end result or you paint on it later. To get that polished surface, you first paint the surface with slip, a watery form of clay, the same kind of clay from which the vessel is made, but you paint on that slip and then polish with a river rock, which I think I mentioned before, a rock that has been smoothed by being tumbled through a river. And like when sanding wood, you might have a couple of different stones of different grit, so to speak, like using sandpaper from a coarse grit to a finer grit. Potters might use a couple of different river rocks to get that shiny surface. And the very last step would be using a small piece of tanned deer hide as that final finish to get that really shiny, burnished surface polished onto that piece. And then if the piece is to be painted, that would be a final step. In this photograph of Maria and Julian, we see the piece on Maria's lap is very shiny. You see that bit of light shining off the surface of it. And then the photograph of Santana on the right, again, we see that shiny surface onto which she is painting. And by painting over a shiny surface, you get that contrast of matte finish of the paint, the pigment, the slip that's painted over the shiny surface, that contrast of shiny and matte. And in the photograph on the left, we see Maria's husband, Julian, painting a polychrome, a multicolored piece, and with different colors of slip, of clay, but also vegetal dyes and mineral pigments to create multiple colors on a single surface. So once the piece is polished and painted, it's time to fire it. And the term pit firing, although perhaps the artists don't actually dig a pit, but have a designated firing location near their house, the point of this term and these images is to emphasize that these artists do not use an electric kiln that one plugs into the wall and turns a dial up to a certain temperature to fire their pieces. Instead, they build a fire with wood and other combustible materials and bring that fire up to a certain temperature, and then very slowly bring that fire down to temperature. You don't want to build up or take down the fire too quickly. That could cause thermal shock and cause the ceramic pieces to crack. So you have to be very careful, and it might take a long time depending on environmental factors, the weather. It might take a very long time, even days, to fire a work of art. And in this particular image and the next one, we see a type of pit firing to create black on black pottery, for which Maria and Julian became so famous. And that firing, when the fire gets to a certain temperature, one smothers the fire with animal manure from horse, cows, sheep, but you smother the fire to create a thick black smoke that penetrates the clay and turns clay that would otherwise be red or reddish brown turns it black. And here we see Maria taking out a black on black piece with that stylized feather design. And we see the result of that shiny and matte finish. You can see the light shining off of that piece. And again, she has taken the fire down to such a temperature that it's cool enough to remove the ceramic pieces from the fire, but it's still pretty hot. You'll notice she's got a folded up cloth that she's using to take that piece out. So I'm sure it's still quite hot. So throughout this process of creating these works, we see collaboration, sometimes among husbands and wives, among brothers and sisters, parents and children, etc. And throughout her career, Maria collaborated with members of her family, from her husband, Julian, to her children and in-laws and even grandchildren. And that knowledge of the process of gathering clay, processing clay, creating these works is passed down in families and throughout communities, as we see in these photographs of, on the left, Maria and Julian and some of their family and community members, and on the right, a photograph of Santana and one of her family members, perhaps a grandchild. So as we look at the family trees of these two artists, this is not absolutely inclusive of each of their families, but I wanted to demonstrate that each of these women came from families of artists. They were surrounded by art and inspiration and creativity from the time they were young children, and then continued that creativity in their adult lives as well. So those highlighted in blue are some of the artists in each of their families. And then they were connected by marriage. So Maria and Julian Martinez, their eldest son, Adam, married Santana. So Santana was their daughter-in-law, who actually lived with them for several years and collaborated with Maria for several years as well. So that brings us back to this piece at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts that is part of this special exhibition. So I wanted to take a quick look at Maria's life history and artistic career, and then we'll look at Santana's and come back to this legacy that they formed together. So Maria was born about 1887. As I said, she came from a family of artists. She learned pottery from watching her aunt Nicolasa and others in her community and her family, as well as neighboring communities like the Santa Clara Pueblo as well. So she grew up learning about the traditions, plural, of Pueblo pottery from those around her. In 1904, she married Julian Martinez, and that very same year, the couple demonstrated their pottery making at the St. Louis World's Fair. By 1912, they were known for creating their highly polished blackware. In 1915, they did demonstrations of their artwork at the San Diego World's Fair. So they were traveling around, not just selling completed works, but demonstrating this complicated and collaborative process of pottery making for urban audiences around the country. In about 1919, they, by experimentation, rediscovered how to make this black on blackware, like the piece you see here, which had been a tradition among the ancestral Pueblo peoples thousands of years prior. But the knowledge of how to create it had been lost. But in the early 20th century, so about 1919, 1920, through experimentation with different kinds of clay, different ways to polish and paint, different firing techniques and firing temperatures, Maria and Julian rediscovered how to create the black on black pottery that their ancestors had made thousands of years before. And that black on blackware became very popular with collectors, private collectors, as well as curators and institutional collectors, and their work is now found throughout the world. So they started making this black on blackware. They taught the technique to family members and community members as well. In 1922, she showed her work at the first annual Santa Fe Indian Market. By the way, that market still happens every year, the third weekend in August. If you haven't been, you must go to see incredible pottery, basketry, jewelry, painting, sculpture, you name it. Santa Fe Indian Market has it. They also, in 1934, demonstrated their work at the Chicago World's Fair, and in 1939 at the San Francisco World's Fair. So they really did get around and share their knowledge and their artwork with audiences throughout the US. In 1943, Julian passed away, and that's when collaborations with her eldest child, Adam, and Adam's wife, Santana, really stepped up. So from 1943 to 1956, Maria collaborated with Adam and Santana on a number of works. In 1952, the reputation of Maria Martinez and her black-on-black pottery had preceded her. As I said, audiences throughout the U.S. knew about this work, had seen it at World's Fairs and expositions and exhibitions, and read about it in publications. And so her reputation was such that ceramic artists from throughout the world were knowledgeable of her work and wanted to come see it for themselves. So in 1952, potters Bernard Leach and Shoji Yamada from the UK and Japan, respectively, came to visit Maria at her home in San Ildefonso Pueblo to learn about this technique first. This was part of a 4-month tour of the US that Bernard Leach and Shoji Yamada started on the East Coast, moving to the West Coast, but one of their stops was in Santa Fe Pueblo. And we have a photo of that a little later on. So Maria's reputation was international, even by the 1950s. From 1956 to 1971, she collaborated primarily with one of her other sons, Popovi Day. Generations of this artwork was shown in exhibitions in DC. In fact, there was a family exhibition at the Smithsonian's Renwick Gallery in DC in 1978, just 2 years before Maria passed away. By the way, this photograph is of Maria and Popovi Day and her grandson, Tony Day, there in the back. So thinking about the generations of artwork in pottery and painting that is represented by her family and other Pueblo families as well. As I mentioned, Maria and Julian demonstrated their pottery at World's Fairs, as well as exhibition and expositions. So you didn't just have to go to New Mexico to see their work. Urban audiences were treated to this work. And again, she and her husband and family members became famous, in particular for their black-on-black pottery. Here's another example of a Maria and Santana collaboration on the left with that Avanyu figure. Again, Avanyu is the feathered serpent, the bringer of rain. We see his zigzag tongue. That is the source of lightning. When he flicks his tongue, when Avanyu flicks his tongue, that's where lightning comes from. And thunder is when he slaps his massive tail on the ground, which is why we feel the vibration of it when it thunders. And on this particular piece over to the left, you see these half circles. That is stylized rain clouds. So again, emphasizing that Avanyu, the feathered serpent, is the bringer of rain to the desert Southwest. On the right, we see an array of signatures of Maria's work over the years, from just plain Marie to her collaborations with her husband, Julian, daughter-in-law, Santana, and son, Popovi, throughout the decades. Now, I put these in not just to show collaborations, but also to note that prior to the 1920s, Pueblo artists did not sign their work. You might know the community or the Pueblo that a piece came from based on its stylized designs. Was it fine line design from Acoma Pueblo? Was it carved work from Santa Clara Pueblo? But because this black-on-black ware became so widely known and so popular, people wanted to have a Maria pot. So she started signing her name, and she inspired others to do the same. So I put those signatures on to note that she was one of the first, if not the first, Pueblo potter to sign her work. And again, give credit where credit is due, including to the collaborations she made with members of her family. And here she is with her son, Popovi Day, in their family gallery in San Ildefonso Pueblo. And you see them surrounded by award-winning works of art. You see the blue ribbons and the red ribbons around, and paintings and jewelry made by family members. So one could acquire Maria and family works by traveling to San Ildefonso Pueblo, but even during her lifetime could acquire it in other places as well. So on the left, here's that photograph I mentioned of the ceramic artist Bernard Leach in the middle and Shoji Yamada on the right, coming to Maria's home to find out how she made this black on black pottery. And you see her pulling some of those pots out of that reductive fire, one of those fires that would have been smothered with animal manure to create this black smoke that penetrated the clay and gave us this great black on black pottery. On the right is a poster from the exhibition at the Renwick Gallery in 1978, just 2 years before Maria passed away. So her work was well known far and wide throughout the US and the world. There are a number of publications that focus on her, or at least feature work by her and her family, published to this day. There are documentaries about her and her work, and even recently a children's book called Shaped by Her Hands that is co-written by one of her descendants, Barbara Gonzalez. So the impact and inspiration of Maria Martinez's work continues to this day. But let's look a little bit at these collaborations with her daughter-in-law, Santana. So Santana Roybal Martinez, like Maria, grew up in a family of artists. So among her artist relatives were potters, her grandmother Dominguita, and her aunt Tonita Pena, both well-known potters in their own right. She also had painters in her family, including her brother, Alfonso Roybal, also known by his Tewa name, Awatsira, and her uncle Crescencio Martinez, who actually married Maria's sister, Anna. So again, these families were joined in various generations, and there were artists everywhere you looked. So each of these women grew up with creativity and inspiration all around them. In 1926, Santana married Adam Martinez, the eldest son of Maria and Julian. And so from 1926 to 1934, she lived with her in-laws. So she had a front row seat. She saw up front, up close and personal, the collaborations between Maria and Julian and other family members. And she learned all kinds of steps in that pottery making process, including painting from her father-in-law, Julian. In 1943, after Julian died, that's when collaborations with Maria and her son Adam and daughter-in-law Santana really picked up. So Adam and Santana worked together with Maria to create works throughout the 1950s until about 1956. And that's when Adam and Santana decided to start really working on their own pottery. And when Maria's other son, Popovi Day, started collaborating with her until his death in 1971. But Santana and Adam continued collaborating until Adam's death in 2000, and then Santana passed away 2 years after that. So both women came from families of artists and created art throughout their life. Again, these family trees and looking at the many artists, potters, painters, jewelers, and other creatives in their lives. So some artwork by members of Santana's family. On the left, a piece by her grandmother, Dominguita. On the right, a piece by her aunt, Tonita Roybal. Here's a painting by her uncle, Crescencio Martinez, and you see that Avanyu figure on the kilts of the buffalo dancers, the men in the front and back of that procession. We also see paintings by her brother, Awatsira. And I love this painting because here we have a snapshot from his perspective of this pottery making process. We see a number of polychrome pots on the bottom there. We see women tending the fire and a younger boy, another generation, helping to tend the fire, bringing that wood for the fire. And this really emphasizes for me the importance of collaboration, again, between the two genders, but also within generations of a family, and how Pueblo families work together to create these works of art. Another fabulous painting by her brother Awatsira, much later from the 1940s. But again, you see the complexity of this imagery, and we've got that Avanyu again in this mythical bird here. So we've seen a number of collaborations between Maria and Santana, looked at some of the influences in their own lives and how they work together, in particular in the 1950s, to create this beautiful, sleek, and modern black on black ware like the piece that's in the exhibition currently at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. And their legacy continues. So both women came from families of artists and also created families of artists, sharing their knowledge of this process, of these techniques and this inspiration with members of their own family and of their community, and with audiences like us. We see just a small number of the kinds of artwork that was created by these incredible families, and see that that legacy continues through the work of their descendants as well into the 21st century. But their inspiration is not just within the families, but reaches to other artists as well. So here we have an artist, Rose B. Simpson, from the Santa Clara Pueblo, which is a neighbor of San Ildefonso in northern New Mexico. Like Maria and Santana, Rose Simpson comes from a family of ceramic artists. She herself works in ceramics, does sculpture, is a writer, is a poet, a musician, an installation artist. And in 2014, she created this homage to Maria Martinez called Maria. It is a 1987 Chevy El Camino that she completely rebuilt. She rebuilt the engine, the transmission. She created a special kind of paint, well, two kinds of paint, really. This black on black paint to emulate and pay homage to the black on black ceramics, for which Maria and Julian are so well known. She built this car from the ground up, and not just customized the outside, but also the inside. The interior has black leather and suede to mimic that juxtaposition of the shiny and the matte finish of the paint. And so the interior she custom made as well. And this piece was part of that traveling exhibition, Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists, that I mentioned before, that was organized by the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And its final venue was at Philbrook Museum of Art here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, I must confess that this piece, Maria, did not fit in the galleries at Philbrook. Philbrook is lucky enough to have 26 acres of gardens and grounds. And so in working with Rose Simpson and others on staff at the museum, we were able to create its own display case out in the gardens and put it in conjunction with a poetry walk by works by Joy Harjo, U.S. Poet Laureate, and other Indigenous poets, and create this outdoor section of this special exhibition. We also had a program with Rose Simpson and filmmaker Roselle Benali, who made a short film also inspired by Maria Martinez and her ceramic art, thus reinforcing how inspiring this black on black pottery, this creativity, this experimentation continues to be in the 21st century, not just in ceramics and not just in particular families, but really for all of us. So I want to thank you for taking time today to let me share a little bit about some of the incredible creativity of these Indigenous women artists, Maria Martinez and her daughter-in-law, Santana, and take a deeper look at their collaboration, at this traditional artwork, and how it continues to inspire artists, curators, and audience in the 21st century. Thank you so much, and enjoy your day.